First, I shall inquire into the original of those ideas, notions, or whatever else you please to call them, It is therefore worthwhile to search out the bounds between opinion and knowledge, and examine by what measures in things whereof we have no certain knowledge, we ought to regulate our assent and moderate our persuasions. In order whereunto I shall pursue this following method. First, I shall inquire into the original of those ideas, notions, or whatever else you please to call them, which a man observes and is conscious to himself he has in his mind, and the ways whereby the understanding comes to be furnished with them. Secondly, I shall endeavor to show what knowledge the understanding hath by those ideas, and the certainty, evidence, and extent of it. Thirdly, I shall make some inquiry into the nature and grounds of faith or opinion, whereby I mean that assent which we give to any proposition as true, of whose truth yet we have no certain knowledge. And here we shall have occasion to examine the reasons and degrees of assent. If by this inquiry into the nature of the understanding I can discover the powers thereof, how far they reach, to what things they are in any degree proportionate, and where they fail us, I suppose it may be of use to prevail with the busy mind of man to be more cautious in meddling with things exceeding his comprehension, to stop when it is at the utmost extent of its tether, and to sit down in a quiet ignorance of those things which upon examination are found to be beyond the reach of our capacities. We should not, then, perhaps, be so forward out of an affection of an universal knowledge. We should not, then, perhaps, be so forward out of an affection of an universal knowledge to raise questions and perplex ourselves and others with disputes about things to which our understandings are not suited, and of which we cannot frame in our minds any clear or distinct perceptions, or whereof, as it has perhaps too often happened, we have not any notions at all. If we can find out how far the understanding can extend its view, how far it has faculties to attain certainty, and in what cases it can only judge and guess, we may learn to content ourselves with what is attainable by us in this state. When we know our own strength, we shall better know what to undertake with hopes of success. And when we have well surveyed the powers of our own minds and made some estimate of what we may expect from them, we shall not be inclined either to sit still and not set our thoughts on work at all, in despair of knowing anything, nor, on the other side, question everything and disclaim all knowledge, because some things are not to be understood. It is of great use to the sailor to know the length of his line, though he cannot with it fathom all the depths of the ocean. It is well he knows that it is long enough to reach the bottom at such places as are necessary to direct his voyage, and caution him against running upon shoals that may ruin him. Our business here is not to know all things, but those which concern our conduct. If we can find out those measures whereby a rational creature, put in that state which man is in this world, may and ought to govern his opinions and actions depending thereon, we need not be troubled that some other things escape our knowledge. This was that which gave the first rise to this essay concerning the understanding. For I thought that the first step towards satisfying several inquiries the mind of man was very apt to run into was to take a survey of our own understandings, examine our own powers, and see to what things they were adapted. Till that was done, I suspected we began at the wrong end, and in vain sought for satisfaction in a quiet and sure possession of truths that most concerned us, whilst we let loose our thoughts into the vast ocean of being, as if all that boundless extent were the natural and undoubted possession of our understandings, wherein there was nothing exempt from its decisions or that escaped its comprehension. Thus men, extending their inquiries beyond their capacities and letting their thoughts wander into those depths where they can find no sure footing, it is no wonder that they raise questions and multiply disputes which, never coming to any clear resolution, are proper only to continue and increase their doubts and to confirm them at last in perfect skepticism. Whereas, were the capacity of our understandings well considered, the extent of our knowledge once discovered, and the horizon found which sets the bounds between the enlightened and dark parts of things, between what is and what is not comprehensible by us, men would perhaps with less scruple acquiesce in the avowed ignorance of the one and employ their thoughts in discourse with more advantage and satisfaction in the other. Whereas, were the capacities of our understanding well considered, the extent of our knowledge once discovered, and the horizon found which sets the bounds between the enlightened and dark parts of things, between what is and what is not comprehensible by us, men would perhaps with less scruple acquiesce in the avowed ignorance of the one and employ their thoughts and discourse with more advantage and satisfaction in the other. Thus much I thought necessary to say concerning the occasion of this inquiry into human understanding. But before I proceed on to what I have thought on this subject, I must here in the entrance beg pardon of my reader for the frequent use of the word idea, which he will find in the following treatise, it being that term which, I think, serves best to stand for whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. I have used it to express whatever is meant by phantasm notion, species, or whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking, and I could not avoid frequently using it. I presume it will be easily granted me that there are such ideas in men's minds. Everyone is conscious of them in himself, and men's words and actions will satisfy him that they are in others. Our first inquiry then shall be how they came into the mind. It is an established opinion among some men that there are in the understanding certain innate principles, some primary notions, characters as it were stamped upon the mind of man, which the soul receives in its very first being and brings into the world with it. It would be sufficient to convince unprejudiced readers of the falseness of this supposition if I should only show, as I hope I shall in the following parts of this discourse, how men, barely by the use of their natural faculties, may attain to all the knowledge they have without the help of any innate impressions, and may arrive at certainty without any such original notions or principles. There is nothing more commonly taken for granted than that there are certain principles, both speculative and practical, for they speak of both, universally agreed upon by all mankind, which therefore, they argue, must needs be constant impressions which the souls of men receive in their first beings, and which they bring into the world with them as necessarily and really as they do any of their inherent faculties. This argument, drawn from universal consent, has this misfortune in it, that if it were true in matter of fact, that there were certain truths wherein all mankind agreed, it would not prove them innate. If there can be any other way shown how men may come to that universal agreement in the things they do consent in, which I presume may be done. This argument, drawn from universal consent, has this misfortune in it, that if it were true in matter of fact that there were certain truths wherein all mankind agreed, it would not prove them innate. If there can be any other way shown how men may come to that universal agreement in the things they do consent in, which I presume may be done. But, which is worse, this argument of universal consent, which is made use of to prove innate principles, seems to me a demonstration that there are none such, because there are none to which all mankind give an universal assent. I shall begin with the speculative and instance in those magnified principles of demonstration. Whatever is, and it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, which of all others I think have the most allowed title to innate. These have so settled a reputation of maxims universally received that it will no doubt be thought strange if anyone should seem to question it. But yet I take liberty to say that these propositions are so far from having a universal assent that there are a great part of mankind to whom they are not so much as known. For it is evident that all children and idiots have not the least apprehension or thought of them. And the want of that is enough to destroy that universal assent, which must needs be the necessary concomitant of all innate truths. It's seeming to me mere a contradiction to say that there are truths imprinted on the soul which it perceives or understands not. Imprinting, if it signify anything, being nothing else but the making certain truths to be perceived. For to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. If therefore children and idiots have souls, have minds, with those impressions upon them, they must unavoidably perceive them and necessarily know and assent to these truths, which since they do not, it is evident that there are no such impressions. For if they are not notions naturally imprinted, how can they be innate? And if they are notions imprinted, how can they be unknown? To say a notion is imprinted on the mind, and yet at the same time to say that the mind is ignorant of it and never yet took notice of it, is to make this impression nothing. No proposition can be said to be in the mind which it never yet knew, which it was never yet conscious of. To avoid this, it is usually answered that all men know and assent to them when they come to the use of reason, and this is enough to prove them innate. I answer, doubtful expressions that have scarce any signification go for clear reasons to those who, being prepossessed, take not the pains to examine even what they themselves say. For, to apply this answer with any tolerable sense to our present purpose, it must signify one of these two things. Either that as soon as men come to the use of reason, though these supposed native inscriptions come to be known and observed by them, or else that the use and exercise of men's reasons assists them in the discovery of these principles and certainly makes them known to them. If they mean that by the use of reason men may discover these principles and that it is sufficient to prove them innate, their way of arguing will stand thus, vis-a-vis, that whatever truth... Now, if they mean that by the use of reason men may discover these principles and that this is sufficient to prove them innate, their way of arguing will stand thus, vis-a-vis, that whatever truths reason can certainly discover to us and make us firmly assent to, those are all naturally imprinted on the mind, since that universal assent which has made the mark of them amounts to no more but this, that by the use of reason we are capable to come to a certain knowledge of and assent to them, and by this means there will be no difference between the maxims of the mathematicians and theorems they deduce from them. All must be equally allowed innate, they being all discoveries made by the use of reason, and truths that a rational creature may certainly come to know, if he apply his thoughts rightly that way. But how can these men think the use of reason necessary to discover principles that are supposedly innate, when reason, if we may believe them, is nothing else but the faculty of deducing unknown truths from principles or propositions that are already known? But how can these men think the use of reason necessary to discover principles that are supposed innate, when reason, if we may believe them, is nothing else but the faculty of deducing unknown truths from principles or propositions that are already known? That certainly can never be thought innate, which we have need of reason to discover, unless, as I have said, we will have all the certain truths that reason ever teaches us to be innate. We may as well think the use of reason necessary to make our eyes discover visible objects, as that there should be need of reason, or the exercise thereof, to make the understanding see what is originally engraven on it and cannot be in the understanding before it is perceived by it. So that, to make reason discover those truths thus imprinted, is to say that the use of reason discovers to a man what he knew before, and if men have those innate impressed truths originally and before the use of reason, and yet are always ignorant of them till they come to the use of reason, it is in effect to say that men know and know them not at the same time. Those who will take the pains to reflect with a little attention on the operations of the understanding will find that this ready assent of the mind to some truths depends not either on native inscription or the use of reason, but on a faculty of the mind quite distinct from both of them, as we shall see hereafter. Reason, therefore, having nothing to do in procuring our assent to these maxims, if by saying that men know and assent to them when they come to the use of reason be meant that the use of reason assists us in the knowledge of these maxims, it is utterly false, and were it true would prove them not to be innate. The senses at first let in particular ideas, and furnish the yet empty cabinet, and the mind by degrees growing familiar with some of them, they are lodged in the memory and names got to them. Afterwards the mind, proceeding further, abstracts them, and by degrees learns the use of general names. In this manner the mind comes to be furnished with ideas and language, the materials about which to exercise its discursive faculty, and the use of reason becomes daily more visible as these materials that give it employment increase. But though the having of general ideas and the use of general words and reason usually grow together, yet I see not how this in any way proves them innate. This evasion, therefore, of general assent when men come to the use of reason, failing as it does, and leaving no difference between those supposed innate and other truths that are afterwards acquired and learnt, men have endeavored to secure the universal assent to those they call maxims by saying they are generally assented to as soon as proposed, and the terms they are proposed in understood. This evasion This evasion, therefore, of general assent when men come to the use of reason, failing as it does, and leaving no difference between those supposed innate and other truths that are afterwards acquired and learnt, men have endeavored to secure a universal assent to those they call maxims by saying they are generally assented to as soon as proposed, and the terms they are proposed in understood, seeing all men, even children, as soon as they hear and understand the terms assent to these propositions, they think it is sufficient to prove them innate. In answer to this, I demand whether ready assent given to a proposition upon first hearing and understanding the terms be a certain mark of an innate principle. If it be not, such a general assent is in vain urged as a proof of them. If it be said that it is a mark of innate, they must then allow all such propositions to be innate which are generally assented to as soon as heard, whereby they will find themselves plentifully stored with innate principles. Universal and ready assent upon hearing and understanding the terms is, I grant, a mark of self-evidence, but self-evidence depending not on innate impressions but on something else belongs to several propositions which nobody was yet so extravagant as to pretend to be innate. If those speculative maxims, wherever we discoursed in the foregoing chapter have not an actual universal assent from all mankind, as we have proved, it is much more visible concerning practical principles that they come short of a universal reception. And I think it will be hard to instance any one moral rule which can pretend to be so general and ready an assent as what is, or to be so manifest truth as this, that it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. Whereby it is evident that they are farther removed from a title to be innate, and the doubt of their being native impressions on the mind is stronger against these moral principles than the other. Not that it brings their truth at all in question. They are equally true, though not equally evident. Those speculative maxims carry their own evidence with them, but moral principles require reasoning and discourse and some exercise of the mind to discover the certainty of their truth. Had those who would persuade us that there are innate principles not taken them together in gross, but considered separately the parts out of which these propositions are made, they would not perhaps have been so forward to believe they were innate, since, if the ideas which made up those truths were not, it was impossible that the propositions made up of them should be innate, or our knowledge of them be born with us. For if the ideas be not innate, there was a time when the mind was without those principles, and then they will not be innate, but be derived from some other original. For where the ideas themselves are not, there can be no knowledge, no assent, no mental or verbal propositions about them. If we will attentively consider newborn children, we shall have little reason to think that they bring many ideas into the world with them, for, bating perhaps some faint ideas of hunger and thirst and warmth, and some pains which they may have felt in the womb, there is not the least appearance of any settled ideas at all in them, especially of ideas answering the terms which make up those universal propositions that are esteemed innate principles. One may perceive how, by degrees afterwards, ideas come into their minds, and that they get no more nor no other than what experience and the observation of things that come their way furnish them with, which might be enough to satisfy us that they are not original characters stamped on the mind. It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, is certainly, if there be any such, an innate principle. But can anyone think, or will anyone say, that impossibility and identity are two innate ideas? Are they such as all mankind have and bring into the world with them? Are they those that are the first in children and antecedent to all acquired ones. Do you have any water? Thank you. It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. It is certainly, if there be any such, an innate principle. But can anyone think, or will anyone say, that impossibility and identity are two innate ideas? Are they such as all mankind have and bring into the world with them? And are they those that are the first in children and antecedent to all acquired ones? If they are innate, they must needs be so. Hath a child an idea of impossibility and identity before it has of white and black, sweet or bitter? To conclude, some ideas forwardly offered themselves to all men's understandings. Some sorts of truths result from any ideas as soon as the mind puts them into propositions. Other truths require a train of ideas placed in order, a due comparing of them, and deductions made with attention before they can be discovered and assented to. Some of the first sort, because of their general and easy reception, have been mistaken for innate, but the truth is, ideas and notion are no more born with us than arts and sciences, though some of them, indeed, offer themselves to our faculties more readily than others, and therefore are more generally received. When men have found some general propositions that could not be doubted of as soon as understood, it was, I know, a short and easy way to conclude them innate. This being once received, it eased the lazy from the pains of search and stopped the inquiry of the doubtful concerning all that was once styled innate, and it was of no small advantage to those who affected to be masters and teachers to make this the principle of principles, that principles must not be questioned.